I spent years building this company from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail to make it succeed. My team and I turned it around when no one thought we could. But the moment I saved it from the brink of disaster, the people I trusted most, the ones I'd sacrificed everything for, fired me without warning. No explanation, no thanks, just a cold dismissal. They thought they could get rid of me without consequence, but they had no idea I was about to tear apart everything they'd built and expose the dark secrets they were desperately hiding. The truth would be my weapon, and I wasn't going down without a fight. It was a typical Thursday morning, the kind where everything seemed normal, predictable, and safe. I'd walked into the office at my usual time, grabbed my coffee, and sat down at my desk. My inbox was flooded with emails, some routine, others that required more attention. As usual, my day was going to be a balancing act, managing projects, overseeing teams, ensuring deadlines were met. I was the chief operations officer of a medium-sized company that had once been a rising star in its industry, but the glory days felt distant now. The numbers were slipping, morale was low, and the executives, myself included, were scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong. My name is Sarah, and I was about to be caught in the most unexpected storm of my career. The past 3 years, I had been the one people looked to when things went sideways. I was known for saving projects on the brink of disaster, handling crises with calm precision, and delivering results even when the odds seemed stacked against me. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I was always the one you could count on. And right now, that was the role I was playing again. The company had been facing an economic downturn, losing clients at a staggering rate. We were dealing with the fallout of a botched product launch, a series of bad financial decisions, and a leadership team that was out of touch with what the market wanted. The CEO, Mark, was no longer the visionary leader he once was. He was tired, worn down by years of struggling, and increasingly disconnected from the realities of the business. As for the board, they were fractured, unable to agree on a direction. Some wanted to pivot to new markets, others wanted to double down on our current strategy. But no one seemed to understand how deep the crisis was. The company's survival was in question. That's when I stepped in. I'd been working behind the scenes for months, quietly fixing the pieces that were falling apart. I spent countless nights poring over financial reports, identifying inefficiencies, and reworking marketing strategies. I'd held meetings with key clients to reassure them, made tough calls about layoffs, and streamlined operations to save costs. I wasn't just keeping the ship afloat, I was steering it toward calmer waters. Slowly but surely, things started to turn around. Revenues began to stabilize, clients returned, and the company was no longer in freefall. I knew I was making progress, but the question was whether Mark, the CEO, would see it. The truth was, he had stopped being the leader this company needed. He had become a figurehead, caught up in boardroom politics, and disconnected from the everyday struggles of his teams. But I had my doubts. Mark was a proud man, and he didn't take kindly to being outshined. Even though the board was starting to see the improvements, I couldn't help but wonder if I was the unsung hero or the next target. That morning, the tension was palpable. A meeting had been scheduled with the board, something that was rare for me. Typically, I worked with Mark and the senior leadership team, but today I was going to be face to face with the decision-makers who had the power to keep us afloat or let us sink. I walked into the boardroom, my mind racing. I knew the stakes were high. A few months ago, I would have never imagined that I'd be sitting here. But now, everything had changed. Mark was already there, along with a few of the board members. Their faces were a mixture of concern and confusion. They didn't know the whole story yet, not the full extent of the work I'd put in, but soon they would. I stood at the front of the room, steadying myself, trying to push down the nerves that were creeping up my spine. This was my moment. The moment where I would prove everything I'd worked for, everything I had done, was worth it. My team had turned the ship around, but I knew one thing for sure. If they didn't recognize the effort and the results, the company would continue its downward spiral. Mark started the meeting with a few words of praise for the team, but his tone lacked conviction. I could tell he wasn't fully invested anymore. It was as if he had checked out, ready to let the company go wherever it was heading. The rest of the board members glanced around the table, eyes darting from one another, waiting for someone to speak up. The silence felt suffocating. "Before we continue," I said, cutting through the tension, "I think it's important that we take a hard look at where we are. The company has been bleeding money, losing clients, and I've been working tirelessly, behind the scenes to address the core issues." Mark glanced at me, an unreadable expression on his face. I could feel the weight of the room's eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. I had earned this moment, and I wasn't going to back down. Continued, laying out the improvements I had made. I highlighted the new strategies, the cost-saving measures, and the positive feedback we had received from clients. I could see the board members nodding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They were impressed, but I wasn't. Sure, they understood just how fragile the situation was. When I finished presenting, there was a brief moment of silence. Then, Mark spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Sarah, I appreciate all your hard work, but the board and I have been having conversations about the future direction of the company. We need to make some tough decisions." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean, Mark?" I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden surge of panic. The board members exchanged glances, and then Mark dropped the bombshell. "We've decided to go in a different direction. We think it's time for a change in leadership. Effective immediately. You're being let go." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what was happening. How could this be happening? I had just saved the company, fought tooth and nail to turn things around, and now I was being kicked to the curb. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. Mark's eyes were cold, distant, as he delivered the news. The board members were silent, some looking uncomfortable, others avoiding my gaze. I felt the weight of their indifference, crashing down on me. How could they do this? How could they let me go after everything I had done? My body went numb, and the room seemed to close in around me. The betrayal was overwhelming. I thought back to all the late nights, the sacrifices, the stress. I had put everything into saving this company, and now it seemed like none of that mattered. As I walked out of the room, I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. I had saved the company from the brink of disaster, and this was how they repaid me. My entire career, my future, felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But deep down, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't just going to walk away quietly. If they thought they could get rid of me and erase everything I had done, they were wrong. I had a story to tell, and I was going to make sure the world knew it. I could still feel the weight of their words, reverberating in my mind like an echo. "Effective immediately. You're being let go." The room had felt like it was spinning, and I barely made it out without saying a word. How was I supposed to process what had just happened? One moment, I was the hero who had saved the company from collapse. The next, I was being tossed aside as if all my hard work had been nothing but a passing phase. I had to take a step back, to breathe, to figure out what was next. But the anger, the betrayal, it was boiling inside me. It was hard to even think straight. I'd spent years building the team, working side by side with people who relied on me. We'd fought through every setback together. Now, I was standing at the edge of this precipice with no safety net, wondering how something that felt so unjust could be happening to me. I needed answers. I needed to understand why I was being treated like this when the company was standing on the edge of something good. But as I sat in my car, trying to gather my thoughts before I went home, a bitter realization struck me. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about what I had accomplished or how much I'd helped the company. No, this was personal. It always had been. Mark had been looking for a way to make this move for months. He had made it clear that he didn't like being challenged. I wasn't the first to notice it, but I had definitely been the most vocal. As the months dragged on, I'd become more outspoken about the lack of direction, the poor decision-making, the way Mark had been letting everything slip. He was more concerned with his position than the well-being of the company, and I was the one who had the audacity to point it out. That was my mistake. What I didn't realize at the time was that I had become a threat to his authority. Mark had never been the most secure CEO, but he wore his title like armor. And I was just the COO doing what needed to be done. He resented my success, my ability to turn things around, and the growing respect I had from the board. In the end, my success only served to highlight his failure. That's why the decision had been made. It wasn't about my ability to fix the company. It was about control, and Mark needed to regain it. The drive home felt longer than it should have. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to tear apart everything I had worked for, to unleash the anger that was threatening to consume me. But another part of me knew this wasn't the end. Not for me. Not when I still had all the information, the truth on my side. As I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't help but think about the board. They were complicit in this too. They had allowed Mark to drive the company to the brink of disaster, and now they were going along with his decision to remove the one person who had fought to save it. They'd all been too afraid to stand up to him. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the company. The very company I had worked so hard to keep afloat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying the day's events over and over in my mind. But one thought kept coming back to me. They had underestimated me. They thought they could just brush me aside and I would disappear. But that wasn't going to happen. I had a plan. I had the power to expose the truth, and I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at Mark. It was about holding the people who were truly responsible accountable. It was about making sure the company didn't just fall apart in the wake of this decision. If Mark and the board wanted to push me out, they had no idea what they were dealing with. I spent the next few days reviewing the company's financials, emails, reports, everything. I had kept track of the important decisions, the meetings, the deals, the numbers. I knew where the skeletons were buried. The more I dug, the more I found. There were discrepancies in the financial records, irregularities in vendor payments, and questionable investments that didn't add up. Mark's leadership had been a disaster, and now the board was complicit in it. But there was something deeper, something darker. I had always suspected it, but now I was sure of it. Mark and a few members of the board had been taking kickbacks, funneling money through shell companies, and using the company's funds for personal gain. The more I looked, the more I saw that the company's financial troubles were not just the result of poor decision-making. They were the result of deliberate actions to line their pockets at the expense of everyone else. This wasn't just about a CEO failing to lead. This was corruption at the highest level. I needed more proof, though. I needed to make sure that I wasn't just reacting out of anger, that my suspicions were founded on facts. That's when I called Claire. Claire had worked in the legal department for years. She was sharp, observant, and she knew how to navigate the complex legal landscape of corporate America. She had always been someone I could rely on when I needed answers, and I knew she had been suspicious about Mark and the board's actions for some time. We had worked together closely on several projects, and I trusted her implicitly. I called her that evening, telling her I needed to meet. When I arrived at her apartment, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I jumped straight into the conversation. "Claire, I need your help," I said, my voice low. "I've been digging into the company's financials, and I think I've found something." Claire raised an eyebrow. She wasn't one for drama, and I could tell she was already processing everything I said. "What did you find?" "Kickbacks. Fraud. There's more going on here than just a CEO making bad decisions. I think Mark and some members of the board have been embezzling company funds." Claire's face went pale. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, processing the information. Then, finally, she spoke. "Sarah, you need to be careful. If you're right, this is bigger than you think. They won't hesitate to bury you if you try to go public with this." "I know," I said, my voice steady. "But I can't let this go. I need to expose them." Claire nodded slowly. "All right, I'll help you. But you need to be prepared. If we do this, it's not just your job on the line. It's your career, and possibly your freedom." "I'm ready," I said, my resolve hardening. "We're going to take them down." The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. I couldn't afford to waste time. I had already made the decision to expose Mark and the board for what they were. corrupt, manipulative, and blind to the damage they'd done to the company. But to do that, I needed airtight evidence. Claire had agreed to help me, and together, we began piecing together the puzzle. The company's financial records had always been my domain as COO, so I knew exactly where to look. But as I combed through transaction reports, budget forecasts, and vendor contracts, I found myself sinking deeper into the web of deceit. The discrepancies were glaring. Payments to unknown entities, inflated invoices for services that never materialized, and an inexplicable transfer of company funds to a private account under Mark's name. The deeper I dug, the more I found. I wasn't just uncovering mistakes. I was uncovering a deliberate scheme. At first, I didn't want to believe it. This couldn't be happening. These kinds of things didn't happen in the companies I worked for. But as the days passed, the evidence was undeniable. The entire company was being bled dry by the very people who were supposed to protect it. Knew that exposing this corruption would be no easy task. Mark and the board had power, influence, and a history of making people disappear when they got in their way. This wasn't just about the financial mismanagement. This was about personal stakes. They would fight back, and they would do anything to protect themselves. But I was done playing nice. I had nothing left to lose. I had already been fired, discarded like a piece of trash after I'd given everything to save them. The truth had to come out, and I was going to make sure of it. This wasn't just about me. It was about the employees who had put their trust in me, about the future of the company that I had fought to save. Claire and I worked in secret. She helped me access documents that were outside my purview, emails between board members, internal memos, and contracts that should never have been approved. Together, we tracked the flow of money, finding connections to shell companies that were essentially fake businesses used to funnel money back into Mark's pockets. The deeper we got, the more dangerous it felt. I began to fear that we weren't just up against Mark and a few board members. This was corporate corruption at its most ruthless. People's careers, livelihoods, and reputations were on the line. There were too many powerful players involved, and I wasn't sure who I could trust. Late one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in a financial spreadsheet was a set of transactions that had been intentionally buried under layers of false documentation. I followed the trail, uncovering a pattern of systematic fraud, a $1 million scheme designed to disguise the real expenses of the company while profiting from falsified contracts and ghost companies. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This was no accident. This was a meticulously orchestrated operation that had been going on for years. I knew at that moment that I couldn't do this alone. I had to go public with what I had found. But going public wasn't going to be easy. If I went to the authorities with this information, I would need more than just financial records and spreadsheets. I needed witnesses. I needed people inside the company to back me up, people who had seen the fraud firsthand and were willing to take a stand. Claire had connections in the legal department, and one of her former colleagues, Tom, was still working there. Tom had always been a straight shooter, someone who didn't tolerate corporate malfeasance. If anyone could help corroborate what I had found, it was him. I reached out to Tom, arranging a secret meeting at a cafe far from the office. When he showed up, his face was drawn with concern. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, sitting down across from me. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tom, I need your help. I've found something big. It's not just about poor leadership anymore. It's about fraud. Mark and several members of the board have been stealing from the company, using it as their personal piggy bank." Tom's eyes widened. He looked around, as if making sure no one could overhear. "Are you serious? I've suspected something was off for a while, but I didn't know it was this bad. What can I do?" "I need you to help me verify this," I said, pushing a folder toward him. "These are the documents I've found so far. You've seen the inner workings of this place. You know how things are supposed to be done. I need you to look at these contracts, these transfers. Tell me what you see." Tom hesitated for a moment before flipping through the papers. He read silently, his face growing more tense with each page he turned. "This is bad, Sarah. These numbers don't add up. And these vendor contracts, they're complete fabrications. Mark's been using the company as a front for personal gain. And the board, God, they've known about this. They've been turning a blind eye, letting him do whatever he wants. I nodded, a sick feeling in my stomach. I need you to be willing to testify if this goes public, Tom. I can't do this alone. He looked up from the papers, his expression grave. I'm in. I don't know if we can take them down, but I won't let them get away with this. I'll help you any way I can. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Tom's support was a game changer. With him on my side, we had a shot at this. But I knew we had to act fast. The board would start covering their tracks soon. Mark was too powerful to let this go down without a fight. I spent the next few days gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. Claire sent me more documents, Tom corroborated my findings, and together, we compiled a dossier of evidence that would be impossible for anyone to ignore. This wasn't just about exposing Mark. It was about saving the company from falling into the hands of people who only cared about their own wealth and power. We had everything we needed. Now, it was time to make the move. The moment had come. I had all the evidence I needed, and I was ready to confront the people who had stolen everything from me, and from the company. I'd spent days meticulously collecting documents, verifying facts, and ensuring that everything lined up perfectly. It wasn't just about getting back at Mark or the board. It was about protecting the company, exposing corruption at the highest levels, and ensuring that the truth came out. I called a meeting with Claire, Tom, and a few other trusted allies from the company. They were all employees who had witnessed the fraud firsthand, people who could verify the shady dealings and the financial misconduct that had been covered up for so long. The plan was simple: expose the truth, take it to the board, and make sure the media knew exactly what had been happening behind closed doors. The stakes were higher than ever. I knew the risks. Going up against Mark and the board would not be easy. They had too much power, too many resources, and too many connections. But I was ready, we all were. There was no turning back now. I scheduled the meeting with the board, under the guise of a routine check-in. But this time, it wasn't going to be business as usual. This time, I wasn't just going to sit in the back taking notes. I was going to stand in front of them, look them in the eye, and demand accountability. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early. The conference room was sleek and modern, just like the rest of the company's office. Everything was pristine, immaculate, and carefully curated to create an image of success. But today, it felt hollow. This place had been my home for years, and now it felt like a battlefield. The tables had turned and I wasn't walking in as the COO. Today I was the whistleblower, the one who would expose everything. I took a deep breath as I entered the room. Mark was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a few of the board members. He gave me a tight smile, his eyes betraying nothing. I could feel his discomfort in the air, but he masked it well. He was used to controlling the room, to being the center of attention. Today, he wouldn't have that luxury. I sat down at the table, steadying myself. This was my moment. I had prepared for this, but nothing could truly prepare me for the weight of what I was about to do. Mark started the meeting in his usual fashion, reciting the agenda with a sense of practiced authority. But today, I wasn't interested in hearing about projections or client meetings. I wasn't interested in the surface-level conversations that we had all become so used to. Today, I was here for one reason, and one reason only. Before we get into the agenda, I said, my voice cutting through the usual pleasantries. The room fell silent. Mark glanced at me, his smile faltering just slightly. I need to address something important. He looked at me, raising an eyebrow. What's this about, Sarah? I took a deep breath, and then slid a thick folder across the table. The evidence was all there: contracts, financial reports, internal memos, and vendor invoices. It was a damning collection of documents that laid bare the fraud that had been going on behind the scenes. Mark, you and the board have been stealing from this company, I said, my voice firm, unwavering. For months, you've been diverting company funds into private accounts. The contracts you've signed are fictitious, the vendors are ghost companies, and the financials have been manipulated to make it look like the company is performing better than it really is. This isn't just bad management, this is fraud! The room went still. Mark's face had drained of color, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Sarah," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But this is baseless. You've been terminated, and you no longer have any standing in this company. These accusations are nothing but personal grievances." I could feel the tension building, but I refused to back down. "I've got the proof, Mark," I said, "and so do the people in this room." Claire, Tom, and a few others nodded, supporting my claim. Tom stood up, his face red with anger. "Mark, we've seen the numbers. We've seen the contracts you've approved. This is no accident. You've been using this company as your personal piggy bank. The rest of us have been working our asses off while you line your pockets with stolen money." One of the board members, Sandra, who had always been a bit more sympathetic to me, spoke up. "Are these allegations true, Mark?" Mark's gaze flickered toward her, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his calm exterior. "Sandra, this is nonsense. There's no evidence." "I've got all the evidence you need," I interrupted. "I've already sent this dossier to the press. If you want to continue denying this, be my guest. But you can't silence the truth anymore. It's out there, and it's only a matter of time before the media picks it up." The room was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of panic. Mark's grip on the company had always been strong, but now it was slipping. The board members who had been complicit in his scheme were beginning to look uncomfortable. Some of them avoided eye contact while others shifted in their seats, clearly realizing that the walls were closing in on them. Mark slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "You think you can just come in here and destroy everything we've worked for?" he spat. "You're nothing but a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. You don't know what you're dealing with." I stood up, facing him squarely. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a CEO who's stolen millions from the company he was supposed to lead. I'm dealing with a board that's complicit in your scheme. And I'm dealing with a group of people who think they can walk away from this without consequences. But that's not how this works anymore." Mark stood up, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "You're making a huge mistake. You'll regret this." "I already have," I said, "but I'm not backing down." As the meeting descended into chaos, with board members shouting at each other and Mark desperately trying to regain control, I knew that I had done what I came to do. The truth was out there, and it couldn't be buried anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the company that had once been my everything. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The days that followed the confrontation felt like a whirlwind. As soon as I left that meeting, I knew the battle had only just begun. Mark and the board had been blindsided, but now the real challenge was about to unfold. I'd thrown the gauntlet down in front of them, and I was certain they wouldn't let this go quietly. But it didn't matter. I'd already taken the first step, and I wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. By the time I got home, the calls started coming in. My phone was buzzing off the hook. Messages from the board, from former colleagues, and even from journalists asking for comments. Word had already spread about what had happened in that meeting. The media was abuzz with rumors about fraud, mismanagement, and corporate corruption at the highest levels. My heart raced with every notification, each one a reminder that this wasn't just a corporate dispute anymore. This was about exposing corruption on a massive scale. I sat down at my kitchen table staring at my phone. The weight of what I had just done was starting to sink in. I had made the decision to go public, with everything I had found. There was no turning back now. Mark, the board, and the company's entire future were at stake, and I had set in motion a series of events that could destroy them. But the thing was, I didn't care. I couldn't let them get away with what they'd done. The first calls were from the board members who had been complicit in the fraud. Most of them were trying to salvage their positions, begging me to retract my statements, asking me to give them more time to handle the situation. But I wasn't interested in their apologies or their attempts to cover up the truth. I had heard enough lies for one lifetime. This wasn't about fixing the situation for them. It was about ensuring they faced the consequences of their actions. But then, I received a call from Sandra. "Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how deep this went. I've been in the dark about all of it, but I want you to know I'm with you. I'll do whatever I can to help you expose them." Sandra had always been one of the few people on the board who seemed to have a moral compass. Someone who didn't get caught up in the corporate games. I had known her for years, and her support meant everything to me. It was people like Sandra, who made me believe that there was still hope for the company, even after everything that had happened. I don't know if this will help, but I'm going to make sure the other board members know I won't be part of this anymore. I can't be, she continued. But Sarah, you need to be careful. They're going to retaliate. Mark and the others won't just let this slide. You're going to be in their sights now. I'm already in their sights, Sandra. There's no turning back, I said, my voice steady, despite the fear that was creeping in. But I can't stop now. If I back down, nothing changes. The company stays in the hands of criminals. The days following the meeting were filled with chaos. The media was relentless, hounding me for interviews, demanding answers. The story had already broken, and the board's dirty laundry was being aired for all to see. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: the backlash from the company's employees. At first, it seemed like people were supportive. The employees I had worked with, the ones who had seen the changes I'd implemented, reached out, offering their support. But as the scandal gained momentum, it became clear that many of the staff were frightened. The company's reputation was on the line, and the employees were worried about their jobs. Some were terrified that they might be caught in the fallout, while others were wondering if they would even have a place in the company once the dust settled. I couldn't blame them. I had been in their shoes once, working for a company that seemed like it was on the verge of collapse, and now I was the one responsible for potentially bringing it down. I hadn't intended to ruin lives, but I also knew that if this wasn't exposed, the damage would be far worse in the long run. One night, I received a message from Emma, one of my former team members. "Are you okay?" she wrote. "I heard about what happened. I don't know what to think, but I just want you to know we're all behind you. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how bad it really was. If you need anything, we're here for you." Her words were a comfort, but they didn't stop the gnawing feeling in my gut. I had done the right thing, but it had come at a high price, not just for me, but for everyone who had been involved. The next day, I met with Claire and Tom. We had to strategize. We knew the board would try to discredit me, paint me as a disgruntled former employee, and shift the focus away from the corruption. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I had the truth on my side, and I was going to make sure it stayed in the spotlight. "Do you think they'll try to bury this?" Tom asked as we sat in the coffee shop, going over the latest updates in the press. "Mark won't go down without a fight." "He's already trying," Claire replied, her voice tense. "He's been trying to smear your name to the press, claiming that you're just bitter because you were fired. But we have the evidence, Sarah. We have the smoking gun." I nodded. "I know, and we're not going to let them manipulate the story. We need to make sure the truth gets out, no matter what." That was the plan. I had to be bold. If I wanted to take down Mark and the board, I needed to keep the pressure on, make sure the media was reporting on the fraud, and not let the story die out. It wouldn't be easy. They had money, influence, and a lot of power. But I had something they didn't: the truth, and the truth was going to be my weapon. It was a week after the board meeting that the real battle began. The media coverage was non-stop. Articles, interviews, and investigations were flooding every outlet, and the pressure was mounting on the company. What had started as whispers about corporate mismanagement was quickly becoming the scandal of the year. I had done what I set out to do: expose the corruption at the highest levels of the company. But now, I found myself in uncharted territory. The enemy wasn't just Mark and his corrupt board. It was the entire corporate machine that was working to crush me. The phone calls from reporters kept coming, more urgent and more demanding. The truth was out, but now it seemed like everyone had an opinion on how I should handle it. Some people praised me for my bravery. Others criticized me for airing the company's dirty laundry in public. It didn't matter. I had made my choice. There was no going back. But behind the media frenzy, Mark and the board weren't just sitting idly by. They had already begun their retaliation, using their vast resources to paint me as a disgruntled ex-employee with a personal vendetta. They denied everything, of course, but they were smart about it. They carefully crafted their narrative. Sarah was bitter about being fired, so she invented a fraud story to get back at the company. It was a clever move, and for a while, it worked. There were enough people willing to believe their side, especially given the power and influence Mark still held in the business world. I wasn't just fighting against him anymore. I was fighting against an entire system of lies that had been built up over years. But no matter how much they tried to discredit me, there was one thing they couldn't escape: the evidence. I spent hours, days, reviewing the documents, making sure everything lined up perfectly. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. They were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to tear me down. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I had fought too hard to let them bury the truth. Then came the tipping point. It happened one morning when I was meeting with Claire and Tom at the local cafe. We were finalizing our plan to take the fight to the next level, but before I could speak, my phone rang. It was Sandra. I could hear the urgency in her voice the moment I picked up. "Sarah, you need to listen to me," Sandra said, almost breathless. "It's bad. They've just announced that they're going to file a lawsuit against you for defamation. They're claiming that you fabricated all the financial records and are suing you for damages." I felt a cold wave of panic sweep over me. This was it. Mark had pulled out all the stops. He was trying to crush me in a way that would ruin my reputation permanently. "Are they serious?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They're dead serious," Sandra replied. "And they've got the best lawyers money can buy. If this goes to court, it'll be a long, drawn-out battle. They'll use everything they can to destroy your credibility." I let out a shaky breath. "I can't let them get away with this." "We knew this was coming," Sandra said, her voice filled with resolve. "But here's the thing, Sarah. You have something they don't have: the truth. And if you go public with everything, every document, every email, every transaction, you'll have the upper hand. They can't sue you for defamation if they're the ones in the wrong." Her words rang true. But I knew this was going to be a fight that would take everything I had. It wasn't just my career on the line anymore. It was the fight for the company's future, for the employees who had been betrayed, and for everyone who had worked so hard to keep things together. I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't going to wait around for them to drag me through the mud. I was going to take the fight to them, directly to the public. If they wanted to sue me, I'd welcome it. I had enough proof to expose them once and for all. Within hours, I coordinated with my lawyer and made a public statement. The message was clear. Mark and the board weren't just guilty of corporate negligence. They were engaged in criminal behavior. I released the full dossier of evidence to the press, including bank statements, fraudulent contracts, and emails that showed how they had knowingly misled investors and employees for years. The moment I hit send, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The backlash from Mark's camp was immediate. They issued statements claiming that I had forged the documents, that I was a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. But the media was picking up the story, and they were digging deeper. They interviewed Claire, Tom, and other employees who had been on the inside, and slowly but surely, the cracks in Mark's defense started to show. The evidence I had released was irrefutable, and the more people spoke out, the more it became clear that the board was not just guilty of negligence. They were engaged in a cover-up. It didn't take long before the board members started to drop like flies. One by one, they were forced to resign or were quietly removed from the company. Mark was left alone, exposed, and without the power he once held. But even with everything crumbling around him, he still refused to back down. He was a man who had built his empire on lies, and now he was watching it all fall apart. But as the pressure mounted, something unexpected happened. The company's shareholders, who had been mostly silent up until that point, started to take action. They were furious. They felt betrayed. They had invested millions, only to find that their money had been funneled into fraudulent schemes. With the weight of the evidence now undeniable, the board had no choice but to call for a special meeting to address the situation. As I watched the news coverage and followed the updates from the shareholder meeting, I felt a strange sense of triumph. The fight wasn't over, but I had forced their hand. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. And then, in a twist I hadn't anticipated, I got a call from one of the remaining board members, a woman named Veronica. She had been silent throughout the entire scandal, but now she was speaking up. She had been one of the few who had always been uneasy with Mark's leadership, and now she was ready to stand with me. "I'm done with him, Sarah," Veronica said. "I've been working behind the scenes to make sure Mark doesn't get away with this. I'm on your side now." It was a small victory, but it was a crucial one. With Veronica's support, the shareholders were convinced that it was time for a new leadership team. Mark was ousted from his position, and the company was forced into a full-scale investigation. This wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for everyone who had been silently watching, waiting for someone to step up and take down the corrupt system that had been poisoning the company for years. The battle wasn't over. But the tide had turned, and I knew the next chapter of my life was just beginning. The next few weeks were a blur. The fallout from the scandal continued to rock the company. But for the first time, I felt a sense of control. Like I had finally taken the reins of a situation that had once seemed hopeless. Mark was out, and the board was in disarray. The company was in chaos, but now it was a chaos that I could help rebuild. It was like watching a house crumble, only to realize you had the power to reconstruct it from the ground up. I spent the next few days meeting with the media, giving interviews, and answering questions. The press was hungry for details, but I was careful to stick to the facts. I wasn't out for personal glory. I wasn't looking to become a hero. I just wanted justice. The truth had been exposed, and now it was up to the rest of the company to pick up the pieces. The legal proceedings began in earnest, and I knew that it would be a long road ahead. The company's finances were in shambles, and the process of restoring trust among the employees, clients, and shareholders would take time. But I was committed to the cause. The betrayal I had felt, the anger that had fueled me, had now been transformed into something more powerful: resolve. A few days after Mark's ousting, I received a call from Sandra. She had been instrumental in pushing for the company to hire a new interim CEO to stabilize things. I could hear the weight of her voice, the relief in it, as she spoke. "Sarah, we're making progress. The board has finally agreed to hire someone with a clean slate, someone who can rebuild from the ground up. And I think they're going to offer you the role." My heart skipped a beat. I had always dreamed of leading the company, of taking it to new heights. But when it came down to it, it wasn't about power or titles for me anymore. It was about making sure the company was rebuilt on the right foundation, one built on integrity, transparency, and accountability. But the offer wasn't a guarantee. It was a possibility. Still, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It was validation for everything I had fought for. "Me? CEO?" I said, trying to process what she was saying. "I don't know. After everything that's happened, I'm not sure I'm the right person for the job." "You're exactly the right person for the job, Sarah," Sandra replied. "You've been through hell, and you've come out stronger. The board sees that. They see the kind of leader you are, one who will restore trust, rebuild the company's reputation, and get us back on track." Her words were comforting, but the truth was, I wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of responsibility. The weight of running an entire company was a daunting thought. But I also knew that I couldn't walk away from this opportunity. I had spent so much of my life fighting for this company, for my team, and for the vision I had for its future. To walk away now would be to let Mark's legacy win, and that wasn't going to happen. The board meeting that followed was the moment of truth. I walked into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I had prepared myself for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare me for the weight of what was about to unfold. There, seated at the table, were the remaining members of the board, a few new faces, and the interim CEO, who was there to guide the company through the transition. It was a tense atmosphere. Everyone knew what had been at stake, and the decisions made today would shape the future of the company. When the board finally opened the discussion, I could feel the room's eyes on me. There was no denying it. This was my moment. The power dynamics had shifted, and I was no longer the person fighting to expose the truth. I was the person who had to lead the company through the aftermath. I could feel the weight of that responsibility, but I didn't flinch. I had come too far to let fear take over now. After what felt like hours of discussion, it was time for the vote. The interim CEO spoke first, expressing their confidence in my leadership and the changes I had already begun to make. Then Sandra spoke, endorsing my appointment as the new CEO. Finally, the vote was called, and when the results came in, I was officially named the new chief executive officer of the company. I could barely process what had just happened. The room erupted in applause, but I was still in a daze. I had fought so hard to get to this point, and now it was finally real. I was no longer the underdog or the whistleblower. I was the leader of the company I had spent years saving. The road ahead would not be easy. There was still so much work to do. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The company had been through a crisis, but now it had a chance to thrive again. Over the next few months, I worked tirelessly to rebuild the company from the inside out. I focused on transparency, restoring trust with the employees, and ensuring that the financial mismanagement of the past would never happen again. We streamlined operations, cut costs, and brought in a new leadership team that shared my vision for the future. Slowly but surely, we turned things around. Clients returned, employee morale improved, and the company started to recover. The media attention eventually died down, but the lessons learned during that time stayed with me. I had faced unimaginable challenges, but I had come out stronger. The company had been saved, not by the ones who led it, but by the ones who refused to stand by and let it be destroyed. It wasn't about power or wealth. It was about integrity, courage, and the unwavering belief that the truth could always find a way to the surface. In the end, I didn't just save the company from a crisis, I saved myself. And I knew that, with the right leadership, the company would continue to grow, thrive, and never forget the lessons learned from the hardest chapter in its history.